Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in this episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the German philosopher Schopenhauer and his view on the importance and on the limitations of language. More specifically, why it's important to learn new languages, but at the same time, why it is language is ultimately insufficient for putting us in contact with the deepest of truths. Okay, so let me start with the French 19th century author Gustave Flaubert, known primarily for his novel Madame Bovary. So Flaubert once said that in his writing, he was always looking for le mot juste, the right word or the just word. In other words, he had this ideal of linguistic precision. He wanted to always find the right word to convey his thoughts and ideas so that his readers would get those exact, certain, precise impressions. For him, there were no such things as synonyms, just the exact correct word. In fact, Flaubert was so determined to find the right words that writing for him was almost always a struggle. I mean, sometimes he'd spend a week just to barely finish one page. This is what he says about writing. He says, "Sometimes when the words won't come, when I find that I haven't written a single sentence after scribbling down whole pages, I collapse on my couch, bogged in a swamp of despair, hating myself." Wow, okay, so you get the idea. The precision and the fidelity of language was absolutely essential and painstaking for Flaubert. Well, so Flaubert wasn't the only person to articulate these concerns and to express the importance of the precise nature of language. As I mentioned at the outset, the great German philosopher Schopenhauer also had quite a bit to say about the philosophy of language. And here I'm thinking about two essays that he wrote. One called On Authorship and Style, and the other On Language and Words. So, as it turns out, Schopenhauer would, in a sense, agree with Flaubert, but would also have much deeper reservations about the reliability of language. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Okay, well, so for starters, Schopenhauer talks about the importance of writing in a chaste or non-elaborate way. And that's important for him because it's only by writing in a chaste way that we stay nuanced and exact and clear about our words. For example, Schopenhauer references and follows Voltaire in claiming that adjectives are the enemies of nouns. They just render things more obscure and they conceal a poverty of ideas, he says. And he says elsewhere that those writers who put together difficult and fancy words, well, they do this because ultimately they don't really know what it is they want to say. Actually, this reminds me of Nietzsche's great quote on academics who obscure with their words. What he says about them is this. He says, "They muddy the waters to make it look deep." Okay, so anyway, clarity and simplicity for Schopenhauer is important. But that said, though, ultimately for him, it's still not enough. Despite being nuanced about the choice of our words, our language can still fail us, he thinks. And that's because our language might not contain all the different shades and colors that we need to express what it is we want to say. In other words, it may not always quite capture le mot juste. Well, so what's Schopenhauer's solution here? Well, it's to learn different languages. It's to become multilingual. And from what I know, Schopenhauer himself knew at least English and German and French and Latin. And it's interesting, he seems to have thought that the older languages had more to offer us than the newer ones did. Anyway, the point is that by learning other languages, we might be able to overcome the deficiencies of our own language. In other words, for Schopenhauer, all languages on their own are only partial or unfinished. And so by having access to more of them, and so to a greater variation of words, we compensate for that deficiency. I mean, after all, as Schopenhauer says, for every word in one language, there is no exact equivalent for it in another. That's why knowing the words of other languages is so important. It's because they're all unique and point to a slice of reality that only they can capture. And it's interesting. Elsewhere, Schopenhauer says that, in a way, learning other languages is like freeing ourselves from the clothes that we always wear and to inhabit different ones. And I think that what he partly means by this is that learning another language sets us free from our predetermined or predictable way of thinking about things. One that's due to being locked inside our native tongue, of course. So it's not just then that becoming multilingual gives us access to more words, and so to potentially the right word, but it's that becoming multilingual can also change our entire way of thinking about things. It can alter our very perspectives and outlooks on life. I mean, after all, Schopenhauer does explicitly say how much we don't realize that our everyday thinking and outlooks don't actually come from us, but rather from our own mother tongue. Well, again, if that's true, then by learning new languages, we set our thinking free to explore new vistas and new horizons. Okay, also, so far Schopenhauer is somewhat in line with Flaubert's ideal of le mot juste. It's just that for him, for Schopenhauer, knowing other languages is also important in this quest for finding the right words for things. But that said, as much as Schopenhauer admires this, I think he's ultimately ambiguous about any such ultimate success. And that's because for him, languages, words, at the end of the day, they're superficial. And they can't quite connect to or capture the real essence of things. They can't capture the ultimate nature of being. In other words, there is an impassable gulf between words and the essence of reality. Now, that's not to say that language isn't practical. It is. It often does the job of communicating what is basically the rough approximation of things. But again, what it can't do is capture the real nature or essence of something. No, ultimately language is just too static and too rigid and too removed to capture that. Okay, well, so if language fails here, what can communicate the deepest truths? What can give us access to these truths in an unmediated and therefore reliable way? Well, for Schopenhauer, the answer is music. And that's because what music speaks of is not of shadows, but of the essence. Music embodies the very inner being of the world. It expresses the in itself of things. Music is not one of the many deficient languages that we speak. No, it's the one true, timeless, universal one, understood by everybody. Who would have thought it? That it's all right there, not on the page, but in the melody. Bye for now.